Katie. As you all know, she worked here, studied here around 15 years ago. It's back. And Katie works on classification systems, but I like to say classification in unusual places, agriculture, non-traditional wisdom systems. And nowadays she is associate professor at Michigan State University. So take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, also. Yes, non-standard. I feel like that's kind of like the Egenis brand, so I'm going to lean into that. It is kind of weird to be back, and everyone seems familiar, but in a completely different context. So I just wanted to start with saying a couple things in general about sort of like the environment that John created for us conceptually. And you know, I started at a time similar to a lot of folks here, where doing metaphysics was often kind of synonymous with doing philosophy of language. Adrian, I know there's nothing wrong with that, but like there is, you know, as you were presenting, there's like other things as well. And philosophy of biology, typically at that time, it was all about selection. Also, nothing wrong with that. But he kind of showed that, like, why philosophers of biology needed to do more metaphysics, and also why metaphysicians needed to consider actual rather than fictional biology. And in general, it felt like it was about sort of like thinking about the meaning of our ontologizing activities. I really thought that you coined that phrase, but I you know, hunt and pecked everything, and I wasn't sure, so maybe it was one of those things that you're in my head and I'm thinking of it. So I'm just going to go with that. So, but thinking about the meaning of our ontologizing activities, not just philosophizing about science as being something that's necessary, but also a line of investigation that was important, especially if we're talking about classification, as more than just stamp collecting. So it actually creates the space for scientific exploration. So while there has been a lot of kind of like philosophy of science investigating the value ladenness of classification, John showed that these commitments and values not only provide justification for knowledge, but also ground biological metaphysics. John didn't just tell us about it, but actually showed us through countless examples, everything from ecology to genomics, and one of my favorites, from like symbionts to race. So in doing so, he had inspired so many of us, inspired me as that kind of budding philosopher of biology, first to Birkbeck and then Egenis. I always think about this as like, well, Egenis seems to be something that I couldn't have done my research as I was doing it with him without being here. There's no other place. It seems like, you know, this was the place to do all the things that didn't at the time count as philosophy of science. So that's kind of what I'm leaning into today, talking a little bit more about that. If I can advance my slides.
Oh, just click with the mouse onto the screen. You might have to say okay to the screen recording thing.
It doesn't say. Oh, that one.
But it should be clear for me using it.
Okay. John showed us that what we want to understand is categorization and classification and how it works, we need to investigate how and why folks are classifying. And I was thinking about sort of like his approach is this practice-shaped metaphysics that includes this ontologizing, category making, conceptualizing, reconceptualizing activities discussed widely in his work, especially in natural kinds and species designations, interest in value-driven metaphysics, and of course, process perspectives. And I remember like multiple aha moments reading The Disorder of Things as a biology student, especially his botanical and culinary examples used in challenging Putnam's assumption that ordinary language corresponds to any kind of recognized biological taxon, or that one unambiguously correct taxonomic theory exists. So, I mean, I feel like really excited that I'm the first one who's used his Egenis passage, because I thought everyone was going to use that. I think it's so cool. But I remember like just reading this and thinking, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. This idea that, you know, thinking about what are lilies and how the scientific term liliaceae is used seems to kind of be a debasement of the English term if it was inclusive of onions and garlic. I mean, the property of being a lily and an onion is not recognized in biology, but of course it is something that is recognized by growers of lilies and onions and appreciators of lilies and of eaters of onions. So taxonomic pluralism wasn't just a thing, but a thing we do. So I wanted to kind of extend this critical metaphysics just a little bit more. And so the title of my talk, Soil and What to Make of It, is a riff, an intentional riff on genomes and what to make of them. And this is the book, of course, written with Barry Barnes. This was published 2 years before I completed my PhD at Egenis. And so it was super inspirational because, of course, we read all of it before it was actually published. And it highlights these sort of super inspirational and kind of like entanglements of normative categorization, knowledge and contextualism, all packed up in another of my favorite quotes talking about the yuck factor. And the yuck factor is obviously about disorder, but it's a normative disorder. And sort of like the best way of understanding this, he writes here, but as anthropologists stress, dirt is not a particular sort of matter. It's not a natural kind, but it's matter that is out of place. This lovely, lovely sentence. The worm in the soup is yuck, not the worm in the garden. So of course I have to like quote that because I'm talking slow. Okay, so things that I have been thinking about in terms of what's included in John's practice-shaped metaphysics are these sorts of activities of making and remaking, categorizing and recategorizing, conceptualizing and reconceptualizing, and this interactive kind of reticulated metaphysics. And this, of course, is also asking questions that are not just, you know, like Ernst Mayer's how and why questions, but also how, why, what, where, and for whom questions. So including this kind of normative aspect of it. So today I wanted to share a little bit about this sort of work that I'm doing right now that's influenced by John's work on natural kinds and classification and processes, and looking at how those can and should actually shape how we think about and evaluate pragmatic choices surrounding soil and care of it. So John's critical metaphysics provides both the stance and conceptual tools that we can uncover. I mean, I was going to say unearth, but there's a different right? So uncover the implicit and explicit use of categories, kinds, standards, and practices that we rely on to make sense of soil assessments. So the reason why I wanted to focus on soil and agriculture in general is agriculture and agricultural concepts are defined normatively. Everything in agriculture is defined normatively. It's an area of practice where values are like an inextricable part of research, of design, and also define the conditions of replicability. So what a farmer chooses to do relies on what they perceive is good farming practices. In turn, the growing capacities of the farm increase or decrease depending on plantings, irrigation, or soil management decisions made each year. So within soil, the capabilities, the farmer values, the perceived plant and crop values, and the management choices are all these like normative pie wedges that are human managed and are human managed in their interactions with soil, plants, crops, and other farmers. It also depends on this kind of continuous recurrent activity. That's why there's this arrow. And this is because it's supposed to indicate that they all depend on previous management decisions, which are themselves determined by the local soil and crop conditions and prior management decisions of these. Okay, so this is kind of, I think, obvious, but I feel like the obvious things are exactly what we should explain. So we can ask, why is soil management important? Well, farming depends on good soil for plants to grow. It's an essential part of the food system. But soil erosion and reduced organic matter content, declining biodiversity, and degraded organism habitat, as well as salinization, alkalization, and chemical contamination, make growing food, fiber, and fuel more difficult for farmers and impact their local and global food systems. So finding strategies for sustainable farming that support soil is a concern that is worldwide. The UN declared in 2015 the International Year of Soils, and in 2017, the Food and Agricultural Association drafted this voluntary guidelines for sustainable soil management in response to this global need. And they, according to the FAO, soil management is sustainable if the supporting, provisioning, regulating, and cultural services provided by soil are maintained or enhanced without significantly impairing either the soil functions that enable these services or biodiversity. So while soil conservation is a global issue, soil management decisions are local. This means that understanding how soil management methods are evaluated and applied in different agricultural communities requires understanding different suites of ecologically, culturally, and historically situated interactions. So relying on John's work on categorization and categorizing activities, ontology making, and pragmatic know-how, I've been investigating the epistemic and normative landscape that has been shaped by categorizing activities in terms of crops, in terms of farming techniques, in terms of soil microbial interactions, as part of an NSF grant project actually called Epistemic and Ethical Functions of Categories in the Agricultural Sciences. I wanted to share a bit of what I'm doing about that today with y'all. So these are the three questions that I'm going to try to answer with kind of John-inspired ontology and metaphysics. So how do farmers make decisions about soil technology and strategies they adopt? What epistemological and value commitments inform farmers' agricultural management choices, and what role do prior categorizing activities shape knowledge-making activities and inform normative soil concepts and methods of experimentation? Okay, so I'll start with the first question. So the first question is to remind you, how do farmers make decisions about soil strategies they adopt? So in soil management, one of the big things that a farmer needs to decide is whether they should turn over their soil or not, and this is called tilling. Generally speaking, there's like a lot of debate about whether you should till or no till. That's a different talk, okay? But I wanted to share a couple of quotes from survey data for Michigan and Missouri farmers. This is actually a survey data that goes on every year. And this is just two different approaches of Michigan and Missouri farmers, but show that they don't agree on whether to till or not to till, what counts as good soil or not, whether it's like undisturbed, which would be no till, or wet and loose would be to till it. And the responses represent some of the different strategies and considerations that farmers, especially in the Midwest Corn Belt, use. So as these descriptions show, there's a whole bunch of different things that are going on. So weather, season, soil type, soil organic biodiversity, crop rotation, ecological history of the land, local knowledge, and culture. These are just some factors. They are broadly pluralist, even in terms of like what counts as good soil and what is what is good soil management and what it requires. This actually goes along with the second question I had, and that second question was what epistemological and value commitments inform farmers' agricultural management choices. And this was done a little bit in terms of like a meta-analysis of all this data. And this Roche-McNally et al. Paper. And they found that one thing that's going on is that farmers rely on different perspectives. They have different perspectives to inform their decision-making around soil. And they describe this, Roche-McNally et al. Describe this as like a soil stewardship ethic. Other social scientists have described this as what is it to be a good farmer, or considering how and why to make the soil healthier. So thinking about this in terms of conservationist or productivist approaches. Okay, I want to then go quickly to the third question I posed, which is what role do prior categorization activities shape knowledge-making activities and inform normative soil concepts? And to do this, I turn from farmers' decisions about soil management to an institution-prescribed classification. This is the USDA 1961 Land Capability Classification by Klingbeil and Montgomery. And so in this is an institutionalized classification. An institutionalized classification is everything from agricultural standards to tell you, whether something is edible or not, or for sale as an agricultural product, but also in terms of even the use of particular classification systems, Linnaean classification system, are often used in a way that's considered it's scientific, or we're just using it for its usefulness because it's pragmatically useful. And so what that does often is it kind of black boxes all the kind of metaphysical baggage, or claims that the metaphysical baggage doesn't need to be unpacked. And one of these is this land capability classification. So the USDA land capability classification asserts that there are different classes of soils. This is this massive text. I just wanted to kind of like crop out part of the table, which actually talks about the different capability units, subclasses, and classes. I mean, I told you it was about classification, just in case you didn't believe me. We're still talking about classification, we're just talking about classification of capability. So in this, a lot of what's going on is they're talking about the class of soils with severe limitations that reduce the choice of plants or require special conservation practices, or in class 4, those with very severe limitations. That's just code for like, don't bother. Don't bother planting anything, it's not going to grow anyway. Okay, so Clingaville and Montgomery's 1961 was not intended to be used outside the US. It was specific to the capability categorizations reflecting US-based environmental conditions at the time and management practices. However, this land capability classification system has actually been modified to fit a whole bunch of different agricultural regions, both from within the US and outside of the US. One of these I want to talk about is the application of this in the northern Ethiopian highlands. So in developing a conservation planning framework for the northern Ethiopian highlands, agricultural extension researchers began with a treatment-oriented classification, and they found that to be highly unsuitable without modification, because it was not inclusive of the indigenous conservation techniques that had been practiced like for 800 years. They were like, oh, don't need to think about that. And these kinds of techniques included contour plowing on steep terrains, picture of that. And this produces furrows which trap water and then slowly filter into the soil, reducing erosion. This particular structure is called a waiver, which is like a semi-permanent terrace, which is comprised of discontinuous embankments and terraces. In higher terrains, they have cab or carrot, and those are built with stone walls and embankments in order to prevent even further runoff. So interestingly, like building waiver and cab and carrot is a community activity. It's social groups, about 5 to 15 neighbors and relatives are required. And this is one thing that is dissimilar to what the recommendations were that were coming from outside. They were suggesting that they just plow everything flat, which of course would entail like hundreds and thousands of people. So the agricultural and cultural history of indigenous soil management in the area shapes the land, quite literally shapes the land, but also, interestingly, it also shapes the categorization of what's a good farmer. So normative categories of what's a good farmer. And in surveys and interviews with farmers and elders, a good farmer is one that maintains the terrace, builds the terrace and maintains it, so much so that if you do not maintain your terrace, you might be fined or cast out. So it's not just a recommendation. So these kind of activities and these kind of normative valuations also led, interestingly, to reclassification of soil capability. So reclassified class 3 and class 4 soils in the original US-based land capability classification of Clingaville and Montgomery as having either severe or very severe limitations due to steep slopes. And they were reclassified so that they were more fit for agricultural use when evaluated for the agricultural capacity in the Ethiopian highlands, given the unique ecological and cultural history of the indigenous soil management practices. And this happened, as I say, over 800 years. So this is not just oh, we fixed it and move on. It's actually the result of this process of continuing and sharing knowledge about these processes and about these practices to each generation. Okay, so like this is a huge shift. Okay, and I was gonna have a slide to like warmed you up for this, but like I'm just gonna do it. So like this is a soil train. This is the excuse that I have to put this picture of a soil train because it's like the coolest thing possible. Love trains. Soil is pretty cool. And this used to be a thing, right? Like they used to have soil trains at Michigan State University, and all across Michigan, also elsewhere, also in like New York and stuff like that. So the reason why I have this excuse for having the soil train picture is that research that was being conducted in the Ethiopian highlands was this agricultural extension research, working with agronomists and with farmers. And that is one of the things that I wanted to be talking about today, like a little bit about like how this sort of knowledge that's like in between academic knowledge and local knowledge and how that arises and how that's interesting, how it helps us answer questions about kinds. So this work probably requires a little bit of background. So let me give you a kind of like an integrated history and philosophy of this specialized form of knowledge. It's a collaboratively formed agricultural knowledge. Agricultural extension in the US is this formalized system of communication between extension, agronomists, and farmers to exchange ideas about increasing crop diversity, provide nutrient support for soil. That was initiated by the Hatch Act of 1887, which created these what are called land grant universities. Michigan State University was actually the first one. And these land grant universities were to provide education in agriculture, education, as well as liberal arts. There's similarities between the US, UK, Ethiopia, and Europe. In the US, it's still largely publicly funded, whereas in Europe, there's been a move to more private companies, and Australia is also more privately funded. But they have very different histories. Modern extension, of course, there has been extension type work a long time before this. Modern extension began in Dublin in 1847 with Lord Clarendon's traveling instructors during the Great Famine. It expanded to Germany in the 1850s through the Wanderlehre and like its itinerant agricultural teachers, and later in the US in 1887, as I said, by the Hatch Act, and later. There's a huge other history, which is another presentation about that and how it's problematic as well, but we're not going to get there for today. Okay. So one of the things I wanted to look at, I'm going to try to do this quickly, in terms of soil management, I was focused on soil testing, soil diversity, the soil train, and also long-term agroecological experiments. This is a combination of archive work, both at Michigan State, but also at Tuskegee, because there is an entire archive devoted to George Washington Carver's research, and George Washington Carver is also interested in soil as well as peanuts, just in case you know the name. I wanted to just talk a bit about a particular bulletin that George Washington Carver wrote, as he was director of Tuskegee. He had these extension bulletins. So this is like not peer-reviewed, journal articles. This is for the purpose of disseminating information. So Carver's extension bulletins disseminated practical research with limited, it was intended, the experiments were intended to provide local farmers information about how to replicate the conditions that the experiment were conducting and have the same result happen. So the conditions that Carver tried to replicate were the exact conditions that Black-tenant farmers in Alabama were dealing with, but also with limited resources. So in order to provide them with strategies on which to improve their soil. So he has this wonderful, I love this title. So how to build up worn out soils. This is for farmers, right? There's like, there's no pretense here. So in 1897, he has this 8-year soil experiment. And he actually starts out by trying to find the worst soil he could find near the experimental station on purpose. He tried to find it and said, I want soil that is like so bad it's not even gonna grow a crop of cowpeas. Cowpeas grow everywhere, just FYI. He tried to find some place that they would not grow. And the reason being is that this is a super common soil in Alabama. It's a light sandy loam, perfect if you want to make plaster or do bricklaying, not so good if you're trying to plant things in it. So Carver was critical of the use of chemical analyses because usually, especially with Liebig, the idea was find out what the chemical composition of your soil is. That's the kind of soil you have, that's the capabilities. Carver was like, that's not helpful because we still have to deal with this kind of soil and the farmers are still trying to use it. So farmers had this rubbish soil and they had one horse and one plow. So the intention of Carver's design of his experiments were to reproduce with one plow and one horse on this pretty bad soil. Okay, so this is like the other part of the third question I didn't answer yet. So what's the role of kind of commitments in generating hypotheses, designing and redesigning agricultural experiments? And part of the answer to this is it's in how farm equipment and how people actually attempt to farm in these conditions. Okay, so Carver's 8-year experiment had a couple of things going on. So he wanted to swap cotton for nitrogen fixing peanuts in crop rotation. And then this was like a free soil amendment. Soil amendments are like what you buy and put on your soil to make it better. You can buy nitrogen, phosphorus, you could add it to your soil, or you could grow peanuts. This is one of the reasons why he's famous for peanuts. Peanuts are nitrogen fixing, so they are really good at including in your rotation, your crop rotation. So instead of planting corn, beans, and cotton, swap out cotton, which does like nothing except for taking a lot of water, and you plant peanuts instead. So that was free as well. He did that. And also, there's like endless literature in Michigan State University about the use of swamp muck, which that's probably another thing to talk about. But like, so you could use because that was available. You had a swamp, you dug up the swamp muck and you put it on your crops, free manure, basically. Because you didn't, one horse does not produce that much manure, or not enough. So these were what he used to kind of just shape the conditions, the setup conditions for his experiment, because that's the kind of conditions that farmers had, what the environmental and financial resources they had. And so the aim of replicability and like Carver's extension focused research for the local farmer was shaped and defined by the conditions of replicability of farming practices in that area, and were basically the premise on which the experiments were set up. This meant that experimental controls and standards were set by the farm equipment they had. This is my last slide. Okay, so the question I had at the very beginning, which is a kind of John-inspired critical metaphysics, tell us about what soil is as well as what we should make of it. At least in terms of soil management, I think one thing it provides is guidance for explaining how dirt becomes soil, how it becomes valuable, and another ontological entity. We usually think of soil as a different thing than dirt. Soil is made through relationships and interactions that constitute ontology-making activities, in how soil is conceived of and managed and categorized. Employing John's normative approach to classification and categorization also emphasizes this interplay of social ontologies and epistemologies in how soil is managed. Investigating how different soil ontologies develop and change in different soil communities, and employing empirical evidence from everything from soil science to ethnopedology. I've tried to show how pluralist you can actually be and still be qualifying as a philosopher of biology. And I've also tried to adopt his use of this interplay of social ontologies using a practice-shaped metaphysics to assess soil properties and capabilities that also includes institutionally defined ontologies as well as local community decision makers. So that, I'm sorry about going over. I just want this is big thanks to Sabina and the rest of the organizing committee, and also to John, obviously, and also the NSF for funding me. And this is me looking at soil. That's kind of what I do these days. So that's it.
So questions?